Are you sure he'll do it? It really is asking a lot, Trisha said. Francesca shook her head at her sister and said, Don't worry, I'll get him to go along with it. Yes, but it's not like what you usually do with him. This isn't one of your little sex games to get you all fired up. You're helping me out here. I don't think he'll go along with it if he doesn't think he'll get any in the end. Trust me, dear. I know how to get my husband to go along with things. Trisha smiled and knew that her sister was telling the truth. She had seen it firsthand. Ever since her grandmother left Francesca her wand, she had learned some truths about her sister and brother-in-law, Eddie. She remembered how innocently it started. No one believed the dead woman's claims about the wand's magic, but Francesca decided to try it out during a moment of drunken delirium. As Trisha and Eddie looked on, Francesca pointed the wand at Eddie and slurred, "Make him look like George Clooney." Trisha never could forget the shock all three felt as Eddie sat there looking almost exactly as George Clooney looked. After that night, Francesca told Trisha many stories about how she and Eddie played out some of their fantasies in the bedroom, taking turns role-playing as the other's dream mate. Trisha did not believe it was healthy behavior, but she knew that it worked for them. She had engaged in some of their magical games as well. Eddie sometimes accompanied them when one or the other went out transformed as someone else. She had even met her husband Joe while the three of them were hanging out at club that Eddie had been turned into a beautiful young woman to get into it. Trisha was always thankful for that night, where Eddie had played her wing girl while she met her future husband. Joe was told the truth about the woman he met with Trisha only after he became engaged to her. At first, Joe did not believe it, but Trisha arranged a demonstration of the wand's power that both shocked and amazed him. Watching his brother-in-law be changed into a pin-up girl was a bit much for him. However, after being a bit scornful of what they did, he eventually became fine with it. He did not care what his sister and brother-in-law to be did in the comfort of their own home. Their use of magic was not something that concerned him. However, Joe never knew the full extent of what they did. He had no idea how much Francesca liked to turn Eddie into a woman. She particularly enjoyed turning him into Maria when her friends from work came over. While they had met Eddie at holiday parties, they had never been around him for an extended period of time. Francesca would tell her coworkers that Eddie was out golfing or on a business trip whenever she invited them the few times a year she did. Of course, during that time the girls would meet Maria. Francesca enjoyed telling her work friends that her husband was successful enough that they could afford a full-time domestic. Eddie did not mind serving Francesca's friends and rather enjoyed being talked down to by her in front of them. He felt the power change involved made it the kinkiest game they played, and he knew how much Francesca was turned on by it. Despite being fully aware of what her sister and brother-in-law did, Trisha was still unsure about whether Eddie would be willing to go along with what she was requesting. It was something far different from what he enjoyed engaging in with Francesca. Eddie walked into the room and kissed Trisha on the cheek as he greeted her. He went to walk away to give the girls privacy, but Francesca clutched his wrist and asked him to take a seat. Trisha cleared her throat and said, "Eddie, I want to ask you a favor." "What is it?" "It's about the wedding." "Okay. I just wanted to know if you could help me and Joe out." "I'd love to help you. What do you need?" Trisha coughed and hesitated before she said in a low voice, "A flower girl." "A what?" Eddie asked, not sure if he had heard Trisha correctly. "A flower girl," Trisha said with fleeting smile. Eddie squinted and looked away from her as he tried to understand why she was asking him for a flower girl. Francesca decided to explain the matter since Trisha seemed to be too nervous to. She leaned over to her husband and said, "She wants you to be her flower girl." Eddie's head tilted to the side as he stared at his wife absent-mindedly. After a few seconds, he collected himself and asked, "Are you serious?" Trisha nodded. Eddie's mouth opened slightly, but he was mute for a minute before he finally said, "Really?" "Yes," Trisha said firmly, as she tried to convey more confidence. "I'd be honored, I guess, but..." "So you'll do it?" "No, I can't, no, it's just that, no. Why not? Trisha asked as a pout appeared on her face. Any number of reasons. Like? Francesca interjected as she grinned at him. It became clear to Eddie that Francesca was on her sister's side. That concerned him, but he still thought he could get out of it. Well, it would look odd if I wasn't there. Don't worry, my relatives and Joe are the only ones who know I'm married, and they all know about our games already, Francesca answered. Yes, but you've got to have some real girl somewhere. No, there's no young girl in either Joe's family or mine. Anyway, we wouldn't want just any girl, we want someone we're close with. Okay, I get that, but you don't even need one. I know we don't need a flower girl, Eddie. I know, but we just wanted to include you in the wedding party. Then why not make me a groomsman? We already have too many. We couldn't even add you as a bridesmaid. We'd have to add another person to the wedding party, and we don't have anyone else either one of us is really close with, Trisha answered. Did she put you up to this? Eddie asked as he pointed at his wife. No, this was my idea. Does Joe know? Yes, he was cool with the idea. He really wants you in the party. I know it's a lot to ask, but can you please think about it? Eddie shook his head. Please just think about it. It would mean a lot to us, Trisha said. Eddie shrugged and said, I'll think about it. Trisha smiled and thanked him as he walked out of the room. As Eddie walked into his kitchen, he thought to himself, that bitch is crazy if she thinks I'm going to go through with that. Francesca smiled at her sister as they heard Eddie searching through the refrigerator. Don't worry, she said, I'll work on him. He'll come around. As Trisha left the house, Francesca walked over to him and said, You know, you'd really be helping them out. Haven't I helped them enough? I helped bring them together. I think that's a big reason why they want you in the wedding party. What a lovely reward, Eddie replied with a smirk. It's a nice gesture. It's nice that they want to include you. Okay, that would be fine if I was a groomsman. I'd even settle for being a bridesmaid, because I know what that would lead to with you. Francesca smirked as she thought about it. She then responded, I could make this worth your while too. Eddie shook his head and replied, I don't want to be a flower girl. Why not? Why not? Why would I want to not be able to drink? To not be able to party? Do you think I want girls fawning over me about what a darling little girl I am, like they did to Nancy at our wedding? I thought you liked girls fawning over you, Francesca retorted with a grin. Not like that, and you know it, Eddie retorted. Come on, you can't just do it for me. It's a lot to ask. You can't go to one wedding in your life without getting plastered? Eddie hesitated before answering, It's not that. It's more than that. It's being so small and weak. I don't want to do that. I've always been a tough guy. You're not that tough, Francesca responded. Tougher than a little girl, Eddie snapped. Oh, calm down. You don't need to get all catty with me. Eddie shook his head and answered calmly, Can we please just drop this? No. You haven't given me one good reason why you can't do this. I'm sure I could do it. I just don't want to. I'm asking you, as a favor to me, please consider it. Eddie saw the look in his wife's eyes. She was not happy about his refusal. He knew that if he did not agree to do it, he was not going to have relations with her for a considerable period of time. He had learned that lesson once before. Eddie put his head down as he thought about his options. One day as a flower girl or 3 months without sex, Eddie thought. He knew his wife had cast a spell on herself once to eliminate her sex drive to punish him. Eddie was well aware that refusing her request was a ticket to sexual frustration. Eddie shrugged at his wife and said, I'll do it, but you owe me. I'll make it up to you, Francesca squealed as she hugged him and kissed his cheek. Several months passed before the day prior to the wedding arrived. While Eddie had largely been able to put off thinking about what was in store for him as the date approached, he began to worry about it. He knew that he could pull it off and that Francesca would make it so that no one would ever know he was anything but a little girl, unless they knew otherwise. However, he had the same reservations that kept him from agreeing to it in the first place. Only the continued existence of his sex life had made the thought of his upcoming transformation bearable. Trisha came over to Eddie and Francesca's house the day before her wedding and waited for her mother, Anna, to arrive. Eddie was anxious to get the transformation over with. However, Francesca wanted her mother to see it. Anna lived 5 hours away by car and rarely saw her daughters. She arrived not too long after Trisha. Anna came in carrying her luggage and a bag for Eddie. Eddie carried the luggage up to one of his home's guest rooms as Anna kissed and hugged her daughters. As Eddie came back down the stairs, he saw that Francesca already had the wand in her hand. She knew exactly how she wanted Eddie to look, however, the other women wanted to have their say. Eddie stood in front of them. He was resigned about what he was going to go through, and he waited to be transformed. Francesca smiled and said, "Well, I guess the first thing we have to do is shrink him so that the dress fits." Francesca pointed the wand at Eddie. Eddie felt the familiar sensation of his body being contorted as he shrunk from 6 feet 4 inches to 3 feet 9 inches. Eddie had never been transformed shorter than 5 foot even. The apparent size of everything around him startled him for a moment. Francesca then transformed his body. Eddie watched as the hair of his arms retracted into skin, which turned milky white. His muscle tone disappeared and was replaced with flab. As the final changes came over him, Eddie squeezed his pudgy arms in his hands. It felt strange to him before Francesca changed his gender. Eddie felt the familiar feeling of his penis and testicle retracting into his body and being replaced with a smooth slit. Trisha looked him over and said, "I want him to have long blonde hair. I always wanted a blonde flower girl." Francesca shrugged and Eddie felt his hair growing. He felt it trickle down his neck and he saw as it changed in color as errant strands fell over his newly pudgy face. Anna smiled and asked, "Can I suggest just one change?" "Go ahead, Mom," Anna replied. "Can you give her a slightly upturned nose?" Francesca nodded and complied with the request. Eddie looked at Anna as she said, "She's so adorable." "Hey, I'm still a guy," Eddie reminded his mother-in-law as he rubbed his nose. "Oh, don't ruin this for me. I don't have any grandchildren." "Let me have my fun," Anna replied. Eddie looked at his nodding wife and shrugged as he replied, "Fine." "Wonderful," Anna replied as she leaned down and hugged him. Eddie felt as if she was giantess hugging him. He realized how small was. Eddie looked up at his wife and her family and realized how towering the diminutive women now seemed to him. Anna looked down at her son-in-law and said, "Oh my God, she's so precious. I don't know how you got such control of your grandmother's magic, but wow. She's the most darling little girl I've ever seen, outside of you two, of course." "Of course," Francesca chirped, a little peeved at her mother's gushing over Eddie. Eddie crossed his arms and pouted as he heard his mother-in-law's words. He did not want to be a darling little girl, but he had agreed to be one, so he no longer had a choice in the matter. "What are we going to call her?" Trisha asked. "Ahem, still a dude," Eddie interjected. "Hush, now, baby," Anna replied as she looked to Francesca for an answer. Eddie put his hands out to the side and wanted to shout at them for not listening to him, but part of him was intimidated by their size advantage. Francesca smiled and said, "You can call her Heather. That was the name I was going to name my daughter, if I ever had one." "Heather? Can't it be something a little less girly girl?" Eddie replied. Anna laughed and picked Eddie up. Eddie froze as he looked at how far down the ground seemed to be as she carried him towards a mirror. She smiled and said, "You look just like a girly girl, so I think Heather really fits for you." "Don't you?" Fearing her reaction if he said no, Eddie replied, "Yes, I see it now." Anna then put him down as Trisha came over with Francesca and said, "She is precious." Thank you too so much. Francesca told her she was welcome. Eddie said she was welcome too. Although he did not want to do it, he did like his sister-in-law and was glad that she was happy. Finish getting ready, Francesca. We have to hurry, dear, we don't want to be late to the rehearsal, Anna then interjected. Of course, can you take care of Heather? Francesca asked her mother. Certainly, dear. I brought the perfect dress for her to wear. That was nice of you, Francesca said as she walked out of the room. Nice, my ass, Eddie thought to himself as the Trisha and Anna conversed as if he was not there. Anna then reached down and grabbed Eddie's hand. She smiled and said, "Come along, sweetheart. I've got such a pretty dress for you." "Oh, joy," Eddie replied, not bothering to conceal his sarcasm. Anna shook her head and replied, "We can't have you giving us that tone in front of the others, Heather. If you don't watch it, you're going to end up being spanked or having your mouth washed out with soap. Do you understand?" Eddie was surprised by his mother-in-law's stern tone of voice. While he had heard her use it when she spoke to Francesca, she had never used it towards him before. Not wanting to experience the indignity of being spanked by his mother-in-law, Eddie replied, "I understand, Anna. That's Grandma, sweetheart. We can't afford any slip-ups." "I know, but we're not with anyone else right now," Eddie replied as Anna picked up the bag she brought with her and carried it towards the bathroom. "That's true, but as long as you're a precious little girl, I'm Grandma. Okay?" Eddie nodded as Anna took his hand again and led him into the bathroom. Anna helped Eddie undress before she slipped a knee-length, sleeveless, crimson satin dress over his head. She then slipped the 1-inch heeled matching crimson shoes onto his feet. She clasped her hands in front of her chest as she looked at him and said, "You look so cute in that." "Great," Eddie muttered. Anna smirked and pretended she did not hear it. She opened the bathroom door and let him out. Eddie saw Francesca at the end of the hallway with a grin on her face. She walked over to him and Anna and said, "Wow, Mom, you picked out a great dress for Heather." "I know. I love it." Trisha came over and agreed with her sister and mother's opinions. Eddie frowned as he looked at how his wife and mother-in-law were dressed. Both were wearing dress pants, heels, and a blouse. Only Trisha was wearing a dress. He wanted to ask why he couldn't wear pants too, but he refrained because of his fear of how his mother-in-law might take it. "Are you girls ready?" Trisha asked. Anna and Francesca nodded as they picked up their pocketbooks. Eddie scurried behind them as they headed for Anna's car. Anna got in the driver's seat, while Trisha sat down in the passenger seat. Eddie and Francesca went to the back door of the car. As Francesca drew it open, Eddie saw the booster seat that had been strapped in just for him. Eddie's head whipped towards his wife as he said, "You can't expect me to ride in that." Francesca picked Eddie up and said, "I'm sorry, dear, but you're less than 60 pounds. It's just not safe for you not to ride in one." Francesca kissed the top of Eddie's head as she strapped him in. As she smiled at his pouting face, she continued, "I'll make it up to you." "You better," Eddie thought to himself as he crossed his arms and buried his chin into his soft chest. Anna and Francesca covered their mouths to keep from laughing at Eddie's childish petulance. Anna drove them to the church, and they each took their respective places. Eddie waited with his wife and sister-in-law as the rest of the wedding party showed up. He watched the groomsmen file in. He did not know any of them, and he was introduced to them as Trisha's niece, Heather. Francesca was also introduced to them. One of the men asked, "Where's your husband?" "Oh, I'm not married," Francesca lied in front of Eddie. Eddie promptly crossed his arms as he peered up at her. "What the fuck kind of game is she playing?" Eddie thought. "Were you ever married to her father?" Tom replied as he ignored Eddie's presence. "Oh, no, we were never married," she responded truthfully. Their conversation was cut short as the other 3 bridesmaids showed up. Francesca took Eddie's hand and led him towards them. While he was angry about his wife's lie, he figured he could do nothing about it given his current circumstances. The bridesmaids were named Stacy, Rachel, and Sarah. Eddie had met them all over the years, and they were fully aware of who Heather really was. Sarah smiled down at him and said, "Oh, you're such a doll for doing this." "Thanks," Eddie replied in an emotionless tone. The other girls smiled and complimented his dress and told him how darling and precious he looked. Eddie smiled at their compliments and tried to make the best of his situation. The bridal party then began their rehearsal for the wedding. The minister told everyone where to stand and what to do. On his cue, Eddie walked down the aisle throwing imaginary flowers before he came to a stop before the altar and was joined with the bridesmaids. Soon enough, the rehearsal ended and Trisha and her fiancé, Joe, took the bridal party out to an after-rehearsal dinner. Eddie was seated between his mother and Francesca at the table. His head barely peeked over the tabletop as everyone took their seats. Eddie stared uneasily at Tom as he made sure to take a seat next to Francesca. Eddie shook his head at Francesca and thought to himself, you couldn't have just blown him off? A waitress then came by and asked what they wanted to drink. Eddie's mind drifted for a second as he heard the bridal party members ordering their drinks. He could taste the delicious taste of beer on his tongue as he heard it ordered by a few of the groomsmen. The waitress smiled down at him and asked, "What would you like, sweetie?" "I'll take a beer," Eddie smiled as he told the waitress, momentarily forgetting himself. The sound of laughter filled Eddie's ears before the waitress smiled and said, "She's adorable." Francesca broke in and said, "She'll take an apple juice." Eddie pouted as he was deprived another one of the simple pleasures he enjoyed as a man. Francesca whispered in his ear, "Don't be petulant, baby. Little girls can't have beer. You know that. I know you don't want to do this, but let's make the best of it." "Oh, what's the matter? Is she bored?" Tom interjected before he reached over Francesca's lap and grabbed Eddie. Eddie shook as Tom lifted him up and placed him on his lap, prompting Eddie's face to become flush. Francesca struggled to hide her amusement at Eddie's horror. Eddie frowned as the man started bouncing him on his knee. Finally, Tom smiled as he tried to play a game of peekaboo with Eddie. Eddie shook his head and responded, "I'm not too." Eddie's shrieking response prompted amused looks on the faces of the men at the table and a few of the women. However, Francesca and Anna were not happy about it. Tom handed Eddie over to Francesca, who gave him a stern stare before she placed him back down on his chair. Eddie tried to take hold of the menu in his hands, but he had some difficulty due to its size. Eventually, he got it straight in his hands as he rested it partially in his lap. Francesca noticed what he was doing and whispered, "You have to order from the kids' menu. It's on the back." Eddie gave her a peeved look and closed the menu. He looked over the limited choices on the back of it and shook his head. He knew that while everyone else was eating a fancy meal, he would be stuck eating something simple and cheap. After telling Francesca his order, Francesca gave it for him when the waitress came back. When the food finally arrived at the table, Eddie looked around at all the food on the table before him that seemed better than hamburger and fries that were placed in front of him, but he felt he had to suck it up and eat it. The continued conversation between his wife and Tom, however, was more than he could bear to listen to. He heard the compliments that Tom lavished on her and kept shooting her angry looks. Eventually Eddie could not take it anymore, and he started shrieking in his high voice. Francesca yanked Eddie away from the table and took him outside. She scolded him, "Don't make a scene in there. He's just being nice. He's flirting. So what? There's no harm in that. I'm sure you've done it with other women. It doesn't mean anything. I don't do it around you. But you do it. You've just admitted that, didn't you? But here you are acting like a spoiled little brat. I expect more out of you than to act like any other 5-year-old. Eddie hung his head and nodded. He walked back in with Francesca and sat back down at the table and finished eating. When the dinner was over, Anna drove them back to Eddie's home. Trisha went back home to her apartment while Anna went to get ready to go bed in one of Eddie's 2 guest rooms. Eddie walked beside Francesca as they walked up the stairs. He strolled beside her towards their room, but they came to a stop in front of the other guest room. Eddie looked at her and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing, I just want to get you ready for bed." "Okay, but why are we stopping here?" Eddie asked as he rubbed his weary eyes. "This is where little girls sleep, sweetie," Francesca replied. Eddie shook his head as he responded, "Why can't I sleep in our bed?" "It's not good for little girls to sleep in mommy's bed. They get used to it and don't want to sleep in their own," Francesca answered with a smile. "Okay, Francesca. This has gone far enough. Why don't you just go ahead and change me back for the night, and turn me back into Heather in the morning," Eddie said in the sternest voice he could muster as he placed his hands on his hips. Francesca tried not to laugh at her husband's attempt to assert his dominance with his screechy tone. She giggled as she answered, "Oh, I can't do that, Heather. We are going to be in too much of a rush tomorrow. You'll just have to spend the night as my little girl. I'll change you back after the reception party tomorrow, or the next day if I'm too drunk tomorrow night." Eddie shook his head and grabbed at his hair as he realized that he was spending at least one night as Heather. Francesca opened the door to the bedroom, and Eddie got a look of what his wife had done to it. "It's so cute, right?" Francesca said as she grinned down at Eddie's wide-eyed expression. Eddie looked over the room that had been decorated in neutral colors that morning. Francesca smiled as she said, "See, a little magic just brightened up this place." Eddie was horrified by how girly she had made the room. The walls had gone from white to neon pink. The mahogany-colored furniture had been transformed into white furniture resized for a child. The walls were covered with Disney princess posters. The curtains of the room were pink and decorated with the images of Disney princesses, as was the comforter and pillowcase on the bed. A Disney princess vanity was situated near the door to the room. Eddie could not understand why his wife would transform the room the way she had. He did not believe her excuse that she could not transform him back for the night. He glanced up at her. The look on his face told him everything he needed to know. The grin on Francesca's face made it clear to him that she enjoyed treating him like a little girl. He had seen that look in her face before. She was excited about it. That caused his stomach to churn. "Oh, shit," Eddie thought to himself. Eddie knew that his wife did not think clearly when she was excited. He began to wonder when she would change him back, while part of him nagged that it might be an if. Eddie tried to back away from the room, but Francesca asked, "Where do you think you're going?" "Downstairs, I'm going to watch the game." "Oh, no you're not." "I'm not." "No. You've got a big day tomorrow. You need to get your rest. It's 8 p.m. "Yes, and you're 5 years old. That's a responsible bedtime for someone your age." "I mean, what kind of mother would?" "I'm not 5. Drop this stupid act. I'm your husband. Listen, sweetie. I know you're an adult in your head, but your body doesn't know that. You need more sleep. Did you think I missed your weary little gestures? Now, do you need help putting on your jammies?" Eddie shook his head as he walked into the bedroom and opened up one of the dresser drawers his wife pointed out to him. Eddie frowned as he saw what he expected to see. The drawer was full of Disney princess pajamas. There were princess nightgowns, but Eddie would not give his wife the pleasure of seeing him in one. He pulled out the only two-piece set. A pink set decorated with roses on the pants and sleeves with 3 Disney princesses on the top set against a large red heart. Eddie dressed in it before Francesca helped him into bed. Eddie scowled at her as she leaned down and kissed his forehead and told him good night. Eddie hated being in bed so early, but he quickly fell asleep. The next day, Eddie awoke to the sound of Anna's voice. She gently woke him up, and Eddie got out of the bed. He went down the stairs where Anna cooked breakfast for the 3 of them. They had a peaceful lunch, but Anna started to rush them after that as they had to get ready for the afternoon wedding. Francesca drew a bath for Eddie as Anna set about getting herself ready in the other bathroom. Eddie did not look forward to his bath. He found it to be the least sensual experience he could remember having with his wife as she washed him and gently massaged the shampoo into his scalp. After the bath, Eddie's hair was blown dry before Francesca passed him off to her mother so she could get ready to go to the salon to meet her sister and the other female members of the wedding party. Anna brought out Eddie's outfit for the day. Eddie knew what to expect, but he still could not conceal his displeasure regarding wearing something he considered so ultra-girlish. Anna helped Eddie dress in his white tights. She put his feet in them and worked them up his legs as rested on the edge of toilet lid. Eddie pushed Anna's hands away when they reached his thighs and he pulled the tights up the rest of the way. While he knew he was not himself, he still felt violated by the thought of anyone besides his wife touching him below the waist. Anna then took hold of the flower girl's dress hanging on a hanger. She took it off the hanger and moved towards Eddie. She smiled and said, "Isn't this just the most precious dress you've ever seen?" "I don't know," Eddie replied with a shrug. "Oh, come on, it has to be?" Eddie shrugged again and said, "I'll take your word for it." Anna smiled as she slipped it over his head and pulled the back zipper for him. Eddie looked down at the dress and was unable to conceal his displeasure. He knew the dress would attract stares, but, given his role in the wedding, he knew those were unavoidable anyway. The dress was a white camisole with a beaded belt and decorative, white rosette appliques. The back was adorned with a large, decorative white bow. The dress was cute in his opinion, which he knew meant that he would hear an unceasing amount of compliments about his appearance. While he knew how he looked to the outside world, the idea of being called precious and cute made him sick as it was an affront to his magically concealed masculinity. Eddie then placed his feet in the 1-inch heeled, patent leather white shoes that his mother-in-law had bought for him. Eddie felt silly in the outfit as Anna led him out the bathroom as they waited for Francesca before they went over to the salon. When they got to the salon, a stylist grabbed Eddie and put his hair in an updo that was decorated with white flowers and a rhinestone and pearl-decorated tiara. Eddie saw his reflection in the mirror and was emotionless as girls walked by and told him how cute he was before the stylist put a small amount of makeup on his face. The stylist smiled as she was done. She said to him, "Someone is the prettiest little flower girl I've ever seen." "Thanks," Eddie managed to say before he took a seat in the front of the shop. The whole situation seemed strange to Eddie as he heard the girls around him gossiping even as he was ignored except for the occasional fawning over his appearance. He had never been in a salon before, but he knew that girls talked freely in them. However, he was surprised at just how uninhibited the girls were talking about almost everything. The staff did it as well, but they used veiled terms because of what they believed was the presence of a child. When the girls finished at the salon, they all drove back to Eddie's house where they were picked up by the limo. As Eddie got into the limo, Anna helped him put on his satin gloves while Francesca handed him the white basket full of the flowers he would throw down the aisle. Eddie sat in Francesca's lap as the limo drove towards the church. The only part of it that made it bearable for him was the fact that he did not have to ride in a car seat in front of all Trisha's friends. Eddie waited with the girls before the music started, and he was permitted to enter the church. He walked down the aisle throwing flowers on the ground and forcing the most genuine smile he could manage to get upon his face for the pictures. Joe put his hand on Eddie's shoulder as he reached the front of the pews and waited for each of the bridesmaids to make it up the aisle. When Francesca made her way to the front, Eddie walked to her side to wait for Trisha to walk down the aisle with her Uncle Philosophy. Eddie smiled genuinely as he watched his sister-in-law exchange vows with Joe before they all headed back down the aisle towards the door. After the service was over, the limo took them to the reception hall. When they reached the building, they were taken to a garden to have wedding photos taken. Eddie found it boring, as he always did when he had been involved in the pictures as a man. To his great displeasure, Eddie found that as a flower girl he was forced to take more pictures in one day than he had ever been in, except for the day of his own wedding. Eddie posed as the photographer suggested while people filed past and smiled and complimented him. Eddie's was relieved when it was over and they could go inside. He went with the wedding party up to a private reception room where they waited to be brought in during the dinner hour. Eddie watched as his wife chatted with the other girls as well as some of the guys while he sat on a couch holding Francesca's pocketbook. Eventually, the staff came and brought them down the stairs. They were introduced one by one as they walked into the hall's dining room. Eddie was introduced first. He rushed through the opening doors as he heard his fake name called. He forced a smile onto his face and walked where the staff told him to go. He watched as the rest of the wedding party was brought in. He smiled as he saw Trisha and Joe come in last to the biggest chair before the first dance occurred. Eddie went to walk off the floor, but he was grabbed by Francesca's Aunt Kelly. Kelly knew full well that the flower girl was really Eddie, as did every close family member and friend of the bride. She smiled and said, "Since my husband's dancing with Trisha, I'm going to dance with you. Okay?" Eddie shrugged and danced as he looked up at Francesca's aunt. Like everyone else he knew there, she seemed like a giant, but he got through the dance before he headed over to the bridal party's table. Eddie was happy with the seating arrangements since Tom was sitting at the groomsmen's table across the way from the bridesmaids' table. After the best man's toast, the staff walked around taking the orders of the guests. Francesca once more ordered for Eddie, who saw no reason to complain. He thought to himself, "I've just got to get through the night." Eddie listened to the conversations at the table that went on between the bridesmaids and their dates. Eddie was not able to get his opinion on any matter taken seriously by the girls' dates, who were largely unaware of who he really was. The women were just as dismissive because they did not want to let on that there was anything strange about the flower girl. Eddie seated in silence at being treated like the child he appeared to be. While he knew that if he was one of the guys at the table, he would not take a child seriously, he still hated it. As the conversations continued, Eddie just kept taking sips of water to kill time. Suddenly, Eddie felt a familiar sensation. Eddie squirmed in his seat as he felt the need to pee. He wanted to hold it in all night because he knew what it entailed having to say. However, Eddie knew his small bladder would not allow it. He pulled on Francesca's dress, looked at his wife and forced himself to say, "Mommy, I need to use the bathroom." Francesca turned away from the girl she was conversing with and called over to her mother. Anna came over and asked what she wanted. Francesca asked, "Can you take Heather to the bathroom?" "I can go by myself," Eddie retorted. "I know you can, sweetie, but there's a lot of people here. We don't want you to get in any trouble," Francesca replied in a sweet voice. Eddie hung his head and got off his chair. He knew that she was right. He knew that the world was a dangerous place for a child, so he walked beside Anna to the ladies' room. Eddie waited in line to use the restroom. He started to dance a little as his small bladder acted up. "Just keep holding it, sweetheart," Anna responded. Eddie nodded and rushed to the toilet the first chance he got. Anna followed him in as he pulled down his tights and struggled to figure out how to relieve himself just as he struggled with it the day before, but, eventually, he was able to go. After Eddie finished, he got up and walked out of the stall with Anna, who picked him up so that he could wash his hands in the sink. Eddie then dried his hands with the help of his mother-in-law. They walked back into the hall's dining room, and Eddie walked through the crowd with Anna. He looked up at what seemed to be a human forest that he was being guided through by his mother-in-law until he reached the bridesmaids' table. As Eddie sat down, he noticed that Francesca was nowhere to be seen. He looked around as Anna sat next to him in Francesca's seat. After a few minutes, he finally caught sight of her through the crowd. His heart dropped as he saw her dancing on the floor with Tom. "What the hell does she think she's doing?" he thought before he wondered if he had been set up. He felt tears come to his eyes as he wondered if she was ever planning to change him back, but he fought them off. He was determined to not cry like the little girl he appeared to be. When the song ended, Francesca came back over to the table. Anna stood up when she saw her coming and walked away. Francesca smiled down at her husband as he stared up at her with his arms crossed and a pout on his face. She sat down next to him and said, "Don't get jealous, sweetie. It was really nothing. He just asked me to dance." Eddie squinted at her as she took another sip of her champagne. He did not see it as just a dance. He knew that Tom wanted to get under dress, and he was angry at not being in any position to do anything about it. Eddie thought to himself, if I was myself, Tom would be picking up his teeth right now. Eddie seethed as Francesca went back to talking to some of the other bridesmaids. Eddie watched in bored silence as the girls drank and laughed with their dates while he was left uninvolved in the conversation. The only person to talk to him like an adult for even a few moments was Joe. Joe came over and thanked him for what he had done. Jim told him he was welcome and that he was happy to help even as he hated every minute of it. By the time the reception ended, Eddie was tired. Francesca carried him to the limo that took them home. All the girls said good night to each other before Eddie, Francesca, and Anna headed inside. Are you good to change him back now? Anna asked as she closed the front door behind them. Sure am. I only had 2 drinks, Francesca replied. I don't think you should be in such a rush. Do it tomorrow when you're sober, Anna advised. Eddie interjected, I want to be changed back now. Francesca smiled at his girlish shriek as Eddie rubbed his tired eyes as he waited to be transformed back into the man he was the day before. Francesca picked up her wand and reversed the changes she made to him. Eddie watched as his arms went from baby fat back to lean muscle as he grew over 2.5 feet in height. The changes stopped, and Eddie felt an unusual feeling on him. Francesca neglected to transform his clothing. Heather's outfit had instead grown with him. Francesca and Anna laughed as he put his hands on the white tulle of the skirt and shouted, very funny. Let's finish this up. Francesca smirked and changed Eddie's clothes back into the male ones he was wearing the day before. Anna gave a disappointed look at Eddie and walked towards the stairs before turning and saying good night to Eddie and Francesca. As she heard her mother close her bedroom door, Francesca leaned towards Eddie and said, You were wonderful today. Thanks, Eddie replied as he walked into the kitchen to get a beer. Francesca followed him and saw him sitting at the kitchen table with his drink. She gave him a strange look that prompted Eddie to reply, I need this, and I deserve it after what you put me through, so don't bust my balls right now. Okay? I know, dear. I really appreciate it. Other than a little bit of bad behavior, you were a good girl. Eddie shook his head as his wife laughed. Eddie responded, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I did. I always wanted a daughter, Eddie. I know, but do you really want to settle down and have kids? I've been ready for 2 years. I get that, but I need a little more time. Okay, I'll give it to you. I guess Heather can make some more appearances until I have real daughter for mom to spoil. Woo, what was that? Eddie said as he started to sweat. Nothing, dear. I would just plan on spending some more time as a girl until you're prepared to give me a child like a man. Eddie's mouth dropped a little before he replied, You're joking, right? Dear? Francesca, you're joking? Francesca smiled as she saw her husband twisting in the wind. She smirked and said, I was talking with Rachel tonight and she said that her daughter needs a little friend to start ballet class with. Wouldn't that be fun? Eddie heard his giggling wife walking up the stairs. He prayed that she was joking, but part of him knew she was not. He sighed as he thought to himself, I hope vasectomies are reversible.